And why would all of a sudden the climate people pounce on Willi, who was literally the world's leading expert on the sun? And here's the reason why. I showed you that temperature graphic here. This is the sun, okay? The sun has a 11-year cycle. It's actually a 22-year cycle where its magnetic field reverses. And it's been remarkably steady for the last 200 years. Going back, this is the peak amplitude. This is sunspots, about 150. You go back to the last one, same one, same one, same one. And all of a sudden something happened. And it happened in 2005. We were at the bottom of the cycle when it should have looked exactly like this. It hits the bottom and goes right up. Well, it didn't. It stretched out. It stretched out for a 4-year period of stretching at a minimum. And by the way, this is energy that we get on this planet coming from the sun. Right? The next peak didn't even reach half of what it should have been. And it's dropping off again. There is a lot less energy coming in from the sun. And Willi is the guy who would talk about it. He had to be discredited. Why? Because they want to build this whole climate thing on CO2, which isn't working anyway, certainly not on sea level and not on air temperature either. But the fact is that to have an expert on the sun be able to say, hey, there is something wrong here, that would pull the rug out from under it. So Willi had been, quote, discredited. By the way, he's been recredited, at least in the science community. The people I work with think he still deserves to be on a high pedestal, in fact, higher than the one he was on before. He's a friend of mine, and I help him out when I can. Well, anyway, this is what's really happening. Is this the cause of the 18-year flatline in atmospheric temperature? I don't know, but it's a contributor. And the contribution has to be removed from the dialogue. So you don't hear about the sun anymore. You should be, okay? This is, thank goodness, floating all over Paris. It's me on the front of a Cameroon newspaper. And this is an interview that was actually arranged by your colleagues. And basically I'm saying there is no climate danger from a planet-wide standpoint. They stuck me on the cover. The interview is in French, it's 4 or 5 pages. It's also translated in English. If you go to my website, colderside.com, and look at the media page, you can see the interview in French and in English. It is having an impact in Paris. I also came out with a 1-pager, a single-page, single-sheet. Why? I came up with a 4-page explanation as to why the sea level wasn't rising. And then we read it. So I figured, okay, I'll get it down to 1 page. And I did. And again, your colleagues are distributing it in Paris. One side's in English, the other side's in French. I have a couple of copies with me, if any of you are curious. But again, it's on my website. It's a clear explanation why CO2 is not a factor in sea level rise, at least not one that you have to worry about. I talked a little bit about the CO2 relationship with temperature in the past. I want to show you one more graphic. And this is taken, and this is, I don't know, do I have time for a 3-minute explanation here? Okay. Vostok means east in Russian. It happens to be the name of the Russian ice station in Antarctica. What they did with Dynamite Sound is about 20 years ago, they realized that underneath their ice station, 2 miles down, underneath the ice was an unfrozen lake. Why is it unfrozen? Maybe tectonic results, it could be magma, who knows. But it was a lake, and it was a huge lake, larger than our Great Lakes. Unfrozen, so the Russians said, hey, we're going to make a contribution to biology here. We're going to drill into that lake and pull out some of this primordial bacteria and things like that and study it. They were getting over the Lysenko era, that messed up Russian biology. So the Russians did, and anyway, the Americans, the British, and the French said, hey, don't do this because you can contaminate that lake. Why don't you do what we did in Greenland? Take ice cores and go slowly down. And what they do is they take a tube, a cylinder, and it's silly, by the way. I have one of them sitting in my car. So if you're really curious later on, after this, you go out to the parking lot. I can show you what this ice core actually looks like. It's empty, by the way. The ice is out. Anyway, so they agreed. Why did we do it in Greenland? We wanted to land airplanes on the ice in Greenland. We want to know whether the ice could support the aircraft. And the ice did. So anyway, so the Russians start coring down. It took them 10 years to get down to the lake. I sent them an email suggesting that they take a 100-meter stainless steel spike, hollow, stick it in there and draw it out. Because that way the drill bit wouldn't contaminate the ice. They didn't listen to me. They drilled into it anyway. And they broke through, they collected water, they found bacteria, but who knows whether it was contaminated by the drill bit or not. That's not the point here. When they went down through the ice, they came up with layers. They were able to analyze it. They could take a gas chromatograph and see how much CO2 was in there, how much oxygen was in there. They could take a look at the isotopes of oxygen. There's heavy oxygen and regular oxygen. Oxygen 16 is regular oxygen. Oxygen 18 is a little bit heavier, has 2 extra neutrons. If you would breathe it in a room, you couldn't tell the difference. But it does get kicked out of the ocean a little bit. It's tougher to kick it out. You have to have a warm heat in the ocean to kick out a lot of oxygen 18. When it condenses and falls as snow, it gives you a temperature record of what the oceans are at that time. And that's what the Russians did, and this is what it looks like. And you see, this is the Vostok ice core. The temperature variation are the blue lines. And now you're looking back, and you can see 4 distinct ice ages when it was cold. This is cold temperature, cold temperature, cold temperature. And then you have these interglacials when it was very warm. And by the way, down here, they didn't go further than 400,000 years because that's where they hit the lake. And they couldn't get any data out of the lake. The Europeans, by the way, elsewhere on Antarctica said, hey, we can do this too. And they have now gone through 11 ice ages and are still going down. And that record is there. And you notice the interglacials are all warmer than today. We haven't gotten to the warm part yet. And the specter that you've heard about Antarctica melting and falling into the ocean when it gets warm, think about it. These ice cores couldn't exist if Antarctica had ever melted when it was warmer than today. All right? I mean, you have to look at the truth behind what you read in the newspaper and use your own brain. Anyway, so here we have CO2, by the way. Interestingly enough, you notice carbon dioxide is red, and it follows the temperature spike. You notice here, we're talking about almost 800-year difference between the temperature getting warmer in the oceans, remember this is ocean temperature, and CO2 following. And we know that because a warmer ocean will release CO2, but it has to warm first before it does. So CO2 follows temperature. It does not drive temperature. And the myth that your children are being taught in school is that CO2 is making the world get warm. It's not. It is the actual warming of the oceans that kicks out this CO2. And you can see it all the way through. And by the way, temperature drops first, then CO2 drops. As the oceans get colder, they can absorb more CO2. That's exactly what they do. Down here, you can't really see it too well, by the way, but CO2 has skyrocketed. It has shot up to 400 parts per million right now. It's actually off the scale here. Has temperature followed? No. The atmospheric temperature is flat now for 18 years. In fact, with the sun behaving the way it is, the Russians are predicting a new mini ice age, or at least what they call a Maunder minimum. And I think the Russians are right. Their scientists are not burdened with the delight of taxing petrochemical companies, which is basically what I think the administration is trying to do. They're trying to get you, the public, to say, oh, obviously CO2 is a problem, let's tax the oil companies. And if the public asks for a tax, believe me, the politicians will give it to you. It's a very good way to get it. So anyway, you notice when Al Gore wrote his book, The Inconvenient Truth, he separated these two graphics. You put one above the other. You could see that they were correlated, but he inconveniently left out the fact that CO2 followed temperature. Okay? By the way, this is not uncommon. A professor from the University of New Hampshire did the same trick a couple of days ago at a conference in New Hampshire. And by the way, a British court has ruled that Al Gore's book and movie cannot be shown and distributed in British schools unless the errors in there are pointed out ahead of time. Al Gore's minions fought this and lost. So an inconvenient truth, you're seeing it in your classrooms here. Well, thank goodness the British could do something right once in a while. It does happen occasionally. Anyway, so it's happening here. There's a lady by the name of Lori David who put out a kid's book on CO2, and she just changed the labels. The temperature label she put on CO2, the CO2 label she put on temperature, and said, see, CO2 is driving temperature. and kids are being taught this. Anyway, so you have some reality here you didn't have before. Open for questions. I have a lot of data on here. I can answer lots of questions from you guys. You get my regards from the TRCS group. And if you have questions, if you send it to me, I will forward them to the entire group. And you may get 7 people coming back to you with answers, which is how it should be. Thank you, folks.
All right, so next we're going to hear from Ben Denniston, one of the co-authors of our report that global warming is population reduction. Global warming hoax is population reduction, not science. He's going to talk to us about